me know. I'll try to. Okay, we're recording now. I have 35 minutes, right? I'll ask Kat and Nathan to help me out with the timekeeping. If you see that I'm going over my time, let me know and I'll just stop. On the permissibility of distorting a rival view, the paper I submitted also has a subtitle, which I omitted here just for aesthetic reasons. It would have been important exceptions to the principle of charity. So, just a second, my slides aren't changing. I don't know why. Okay, here we go. A quick summary of the structure of my presentation. I'm going to say a couple of words about the principle of charity and how I understand it. Then a couple more words about what grounds the principle of charity. I'm going to talk about some commonly recognized exceptions to the principle of charity. It's not usually typically seen as an absolute principle. Then I'm going to talk about an exception that's not commonly recognized, and I'm going to refer to a metaphor I find helpful, the stick bending metaphor, to characterize this not commonly recognized exception. I'm going to give an example of its use in the philosophy of education. Then I'm going to quickly wrap things up by explaining when I think that stick bending is justified. A couple of questions that I leave out of my presentation, but they're in the paper and we might talk about them. Questions may come up on these issues. How common is stick bending in philosophy, apart from the one single example I'm going to give? And if it's so common, or if it's relatively common, why is it still often seen as unjustified? I'm going to leave these things out of my presentation, but they may come back up in the question period. So what do I mean by the principle of charity? I'm going to take Michael Scriven's formulation as my starting point here. Some of you may recognize this passage. I'm having a bit of trouble seeing my full slides here because of, let me just see if I can change things a bit. Just 1 second. The principle of charity, I can't see everything because of the way things are set up. Let me see if I can change. Oh, okay. This is how it works. Sorry. The principle of charity requires that we try to make the best rather than the worst possible interpretation of the material we're studying. It doesn't mean letting people off the hook entirely by assuming they couldn't possibly have meant something just because it turns out to be unsound or true. And I highlight this passage. What the principle of charity does mean is that taking cheap shots is something we shouldn't waste much time doing. Other words are nitpicking and attacking or setting up a straw man. Words that mean more or less the same as taking a cheap shot. This is a fairly intuitive but also fairly vague formulation of the principle of charity. There are different ways of interpreting it, stronger ways, weaker ways. I take it in a fairly weak sense. If we look at a text and we see more than one possible interpretation, and if they're both licensed by the text, if the text can bear more than one interpretation, we should choose the one that makes the text seem more plausible. It's a fairly weak, I think, understanding of what it means not to take cheap shots. And that's what guides my understanding of the principle of charity here. But we may have to come back to this and discuss other possible versions of the principle. Grounds for charity. Why should we proceed in this way, opting for the most plausible interpretation among those that a text can bear? There are lots of arguments for the principle of charity. I think they orbit around two major points. A moral point, to the effect that it's just unfair to the person whose views are being described to take cheap shots. It's a moral ground. There are lots of arguments that orbit around the epistemic or perhaps the dialectic point, that if you take a cheap shot, you have it's less likely that you're going to be able to engage in fruitful dialogue with the person whose views you're mischaracterizing, or with other people who take similar views and may also seem feel like they have been targeted by the cheap shot. So I'm trying to describe the typical grounds that are given for charity. I have no objections to make these grounds, although I will argue later on that they're not often decisive. Some commonly recognized exceptions to the principle of charity, as I formulated it and as it's usually defended or grounded. Some people might say that our duty to respect or to treat others fairly when we're characterizing their arguments depends on whether or not they're alive even. So to be charitable, to be uncharitable to Hume may be less of a problem morally than to be uncharitable to Nathan, if it's one of his arguments that I'm characterizing and assessing. There are several papers I found discussing the pedagogical value of distorting someone else's argument. A teacher might deliberately distort, mischaracterize, lessen the value of an argument as given by some author just to provoke students or their audience into engaging in careful analysis and assessment of that argument. And that sounds like a fair exception. I'm not trying to exhaust all the possible exceptions to the principle of charity, just mentioning a couple to show that as is usual in argumentation theory, the principle isn't taken as an absolute one. Argumentation theorists don't often advocate absolute principles. Exceptions are recognized. But I think there is one, and here I'm getting to what I think is the more original part of the paper, and I'm going to spend more time on these sections, which is one important exception, one justifiable exception I find that I don't think is commonly recognized. And to explain that exception, I'm going to use this stick bending metaphor, which I haven't invented. I've seen it described by Louis Althusser in a paper where he refers to Lenin and his thought. Althusser says, when a stick is bent in the wrong direction, said Lenin, it's necessary if you want to put matters right, that is, if you want to straighten the stick and keep it straight, to grasp it and bend it durably in the opposite direction. So you might not need a diagram to understand this, but I hope this is helpful. So if the stick is bent, as in 1, and we want to get to 3, and if we're dealing with relatively supple material here, of course, that's an important qualification. To get to 3, we may need to bend the stick in the opposite direction, which is 2, right? To get to 3, we may have to go through 2. Okay, this is still quite vague. We can be more precise. I think what Althusser is saying here, and if it's not what he meant, I think this is something we can derive from his quote, is that if we find some field in which there is a problematic consensus, and we want to challenge that consensus forcefully, it may be useful either to present the dominant view in a distorted way by exaggerating its flaws and omitting any of its redeeming features. And it may also be useful to propose some kind of extreme alternative, which we don't really accept without qualification, but which may be a rhetorically useful way of shaking things up. I'm particularly interested in the first possibility here because it has a lot to do with the principle of charity. If I want to deconstruct a problematic consensus, and I do so by exaggerating the flaws of the view around which the consensus has been established, then I am proceeding uncharitably. I'm taking a cheap shot. Now, let me give an example to make this clearer, because it's been pretty abstract so far. I first heard about the the stick bending metaphor, and I first saw it being used in a philosophical context in the work of this Brazilian philosopher of education, Saviani. He has this very influential book in Brazil titled School and Democracy. It's made up of a series of essays that he wrote over the years, particularly during the 1980s. It's been published recently in English with the title School and Democracy, if anyone wants to have a look but doesn't read Portuguese. So what's Saviani up to? He begins with a familiar distinction between two kinds of pedagogy. Traditional pedagogy, which he says is content-focused, based on lectures. Teachers talk, students listen, take notes, and then some kind of exam to prove that they can make sense of what the teacher imparted in the lectures. And then there's new or progressive or constructivist pedagogy, which promotes more autonomous inquiry, right? Which is not based on lecture, is less content focused, and is supposedly more democratic too. But that's not something Saviani agrees with. That's why I've highlighted it in yellow, but it's often mentioned as part of the rationale behind new or progressive or constructivist pedagogy. The teacher doesn't dominate the student intellectually. The teacher is sensitive to the student's particular interests and abilities. And since those interests and abilities are in some way connected to their cultural background, it's a kind of pedagogy that's less prone to engaging in assimilationist practices and so on. And that's, the democratic aspect of new pedagogy. Or so many people think, Saviani would argue. When we think of new or progressive pedagogies, we think of people like John Dewey in the United States, a progressive liberal. We think of people to the left even of Dewey, like Paulo Freire in Brazil. You may have heard of him. This is the kind of educational theorist that Saviani wants to argue against, although he is very much on the left of the political spectrum. What he wants to do is shake up the consensus. He found that in the 70s and 80s, left intellectuals in Brazil were all convinced that you had to adopt some kind of new or progressive or constructive pedagogy. To be politically progressive, you had to be, educationally progressive as well. And that's one for Saviani, right? He thinks it's a bad state of affairs because it actually leads to less democratic schooling in an important sense. He said, everybody's convinced that we should take up Dewey and Paulo Freire. And what happens is that in a country like Brazil, you have private schools that are frequented by the middle classes. Private schools keep caring about content, and then they just incorporate some of the more benign features of progressive education, things like smaller classes, modern equipment, and so on. But the content is still there. The public schools, on the other hand, which are typically underfunded and frequented by low-income students, they don't have the money to incorporate the benign aspects of progressive pedagogy. So what they do in the end is just lower teaching and assessment standards. So what happens, Saviani thinks, is that the popularity of new pedagogy is actually making the distance between wealthy students and poor students more significant than it was to begin with. He doesn't think new pedagogy is all bad. But, and he says this very explicitly in the text, citing Lenin through Althusser, he says, we need to shake things up by bending the stick in the other direction. So he writes an essay where he openly says, I'm going to present the worst possible version of new pedagogy, a version according to which it's anti-intellectual, anti-knowledge, and ultimately against the preparation of students, especially low-income students, for political participation, because if they don't get the content they need, they're going to be alienated from the political process and so on. He doesn't really believe that, and he says he doesn't believe it, but he says, just, entertain this caricatured version of new pedagogy for a moment. And he thinks that that might help shake things up so that eventually people will reach three. They'll move from one through to three ultimately. So instead of presenting these authors and other new pedagogists in this sort of realistic way, he presents them in this way, right, as caricatures. And he says he's going to do it, right? He even titles one of his papers, The Stick Bending Theory. That's Saviani's strategy. And there's a significant amount of evidence that it worked. If in the 80s, among left intellectuals, everybody was in favor of some kind of progressive pedagogy. Among left intellectuals in Brazil today, things seem a lot more complicated. A lot of people are suspicious of the dangers of progressive pedagogy that Saviani pointed out. One objection that may come to mind at this point is that, is this really a cheap shot, or is this really an uncharitable characterization of other people's views in the sense that worried Scriven and that worry people who participate in charity workshops like this one? Because the caricature is avowed from the beginning, right? Saviani never hid the distortion from his readers. He said, I'm going to distort these authors' views because because I think this is going to be useful in the long run. I think this is a cheap shot. I think it is still within the scope of the concept of uncharitable characterization of another person's work. And we might begin to see why if we consider a realistic dialogue. So imagine I engage a caricaturist to do my portrait. The caricaturist says at the end, here's your portrait, sir. I get a bit annoyed because, I know it's a caricature and I know some of my features are going to be overblown. But often when we finally see the portrait, we do get annoyed by some of the features that the caricaturist chose to highlight. Of course not, says the caricature. This is a caricature, and you do have a remarkable nose. I only made it more remarkable. I don't have much to say, especially because in this situation, I actually, hired the caricaturist, but I may intimately think this doesn't make me look good at all. I thought that he might make my nose a little bit bigger or my ears or my teeth, but not by that much. I have an entrenched self-image and I don't like how I'm going to appear. If this sounds realistic, right, the possibility that someone may be disappointed with a caricature and annoyed by it, even when they engage the caricaturist, then we can imagine something similar happening between Dewey and Saviani if they're not contemporaries, but if they ever were to engage in direct dialogue. Saviani presents his account of Dewey's pedagogy. Here's my uncharitable account of your pedagogy, sir. He's not hiding anything, although he wasn't engaged to do it. Oh, but I'm not such an enemy of the intellect or of the idea of the teacher of a sharer of knowledge, says Dewey. You've exaggerated certain aspects of my view. Of course not, says Saviani. This is a caricature, and you do exhibit a remarkable skepticism about the role of the teacher as a leader in the classroom. I only made it more remarkable. Dewey's going to worry about it, right? Insofar as Saviani is an influential figure, he wrote short and punchy essays that a lot of people read. Dewey's work is long and dense. Few people actually read it carefully, so there's a good chance people are gonna start to see Dewey in a different way. I think this is enough to show that there's a problem of charity involved here. Right? Even if the caricature is open, there is a likelihood that it will affect public perception of the view being mischaracterized. And this means Saviani or people who engage in this kind of stick bending are accountable. We can come back to this issue. It's just to sort of pump your intuitions in the way of thinking that we are talking about charity here, even when caricature is explicit. So when is this kind of thing justified? I'm reaching the end here. I actually rushed. I hurried more than I needed to, but I'll take my time here at the end. When is explicit stick bending justified? So I'm focusing here on explicit stick bending. It's a bit harder to justify, although I don't argue that we can't justify. It's a bit harder to justify sneaky stick bending, right? When an author caricatures somebody else without letting readers know that if they were to read the original text being mischaracterized, they might come away with different ideas. It's easier to justify explicit stick bending. Although Saviani doesn't say this, I think Saviani is working with the assumption that he's justified in mischaracterizing the views of authors like Dewey and and Freire because he thinks their views, or the fact that their views are widely accepted, has had morally harmful consequences. If there's a certain consensus that's morally harmful, then stick bending may be justified. True, it's unfair to Dewey and Freire to mischaracterize their views, but the interests of these authors and perhaps a few other authors who have stakes in this debate, they are of they're not of very significant relevance when we compare the effects of the application of their views, right? If Saviani is right that the new pedagogy is making the distance between low-income students and wealthy students longer than it needs to be, that seems more significant than any harm or offense that may be inflicted on Dewey and Freire and a couple other people who are writing about these things. Right. Stick bending may be also justified, Saviani doesn't say much about this, in situations where consensus is just epistemically harmful. There are certain debates in philosophy that may not have discernible social consequences. Maybe many debates in philosophy don't have discernible social consequences, but they still may do harm in an epistemic sense. In the paper, I make a joke perhaps about contemporary metaphysics and its lack of relevance for ethics and politics. Maybe I'm being unfair. But if we're engaged in a very abstract, arcane set of issues concerning metaphysics, it could be that they don't really have any ethical or political consequences of significance. But the fact that a certain view gets established and crowds out or leaves no space for alternative views may be harmful to a field. It may lead that field to stagnation. Bending the stick in such a situation may be justified because even if bending the stick seems problematic from an epistemic point of view, if it's done in order to shake up an epistemically harmful consensus, then it may be justified. Okay. So we distort some people's views in order to make a field move forward, or in the hope that a field will move forward and away from dogmatic consensus. Of course, these two scenarios may overlap. We can find examples of consensus that are both morally harmful and epistemically harmful. And if stick bending is justified in just one of these scenarios, then it's also justified when the scenarios overlap. Saviani could argue that he was dealing with both scenarios at once, right? A situation in which traditional pedagogy had no serious advocates because anybody who had sympathy for traditional pedagogy was just not given a fair hearing. That's an epistemically bad state of affairs. And also a morally bad state of affairs because this discussion is not like those arcane discussions in metaphysics that have no real world impact, but it was, if Saviani is right about this, having the effect that low-income families were getting even poorer education than they might. So that's the kind of situation in which stick bending is justified. It may be a fallacy, it may be an unfair way to treat uh, other intellectuals, but it's justified because of its positive and more wide-ranging moral and epistemic effects. Moving to the end here, we can develop perhaps the imaginary dialogue between Saviani and Dewey, if we consider these possible justifications of the violation of the principle of charity. Again, Saviani presents his uncharitable account of Dewey's pedagogy that Dewey doesn't like it. He says, I'm not quite an enemy of the intellect. I just don't like the bookish ways in which teachers traditionally teach. Saviani says, I know, you qualify your views in a series of ways. You're more careful than I've suggested. But this was a caricature. I told you it was going to be a caricature. I told everybody it was going to be a caricature. And it is true that you are skeptical about the role of the teacher as a leader in a classroom. I just exaggerated. I just overblown this feature of your work. Dewey gets annoyed. He says, but your readers are going to get the wrong impression. If they actually read me, they would see qualifications. And here's Saviani's reply, which I think embodies the conditions of justification of stick bending. To be honest, I don't really care if they do, Saviani might say. I know this may harm you or other people involved in debate, but there are, larger interests at stake. If you only knew about the harm that that advocates of your dominant view are doing by trying to implement the current understanding of your work, you might even agree with me that distorting your view is a lesser evil here. Oh, before I submitted the paper for Nathan's commentary, I sent it to a friend who read it and said, there are when one advocates for the principle of charity, one can add moral grounds to the idea that being uncharitable is unfair to the author, right? For instance, the fact that if you start bending the stick, you may not obtain the goal of making the stick straight, but you may break the stick in an important sense. You may, for instance, polarize the field in a way that it wasn't polarized previously, and so on. And that's an objection that I'm still thinking about how to counter. But I think it's a notable feature of the debate on the grounds and exceptions to the principle of charity that we don't really think about these wide-ranging social or political consequences of stick bending. We usually limit the discussion to the more individualistic or domain of who is this going to harm in terms of specific authors. And when we stop thinking just of the harm done to specific authors and start thinking about the broader consequences of philosophizing, at least in fields like philosophy of education, where the stakes are high, then we may we may see the possible and justifiable exceptions more easily. And that's it. Thanks. And here's my email again. Please write with comments, criticism, if we don't get a chance to engage in dialogue here. Thank you.